She was 6 years old, a princess from France. He was 29, the King of England. Their marriage was meant to secure peace, but it would become the beginning of betrayal, captivity, and exile. This is the story of the forgotten queen, a child bride who crossed the Channel to wear a crown, and vanished from history almost as quickly as she appeared. And it begins in the shadowed halls of Westminster. Section 1. The Autumn in Westminster. The stone corridors of Westminster Abbey held the damp chill of late autumn, each exhale hanging in the air like a ghost before fading into nothingness. I pressed my prayer book tight against my chest, the leather warm from my hands, as the hurried steps of servants echoed off the vaulted walls. They bustled with a tension that was not quite anxiety, but not far from it, their arms loaded with wreaths of rosemary, fresh rushes for the nave, and bolts of white silk destined for the altar. This was no ordinary royal wedding. Whispers coiled like smoke through the abbey halls, of a foreign princess, barely out of the nursery, sent across the Channel to wed our sovereign. "A child," murmured one choir boy to another as they polished the brass candle holders. "So small she must stand on a stool to see over the altar rail." I pretended not to hear, but even my own mind echoed with questions. When the oak doors groaned open and the first glimmers of sunlight touched the nave, the wedding procession entered in measured grandeur. King Edmund IV walked at its head, tall, broad-shouldered, with hair the color of wheat at harvest. At 28, he had the poise of a man long accustomed to command, but there was a softness to his eyes that made people trust him. Beside him, holding his gloved hand, was a girl no taller than his elbow. Princess Ameline of Artois, daughter of King Louis of France, looked like a doll carved from ivory. Her gown of pale gold shimmered with every step, the hem almost tripping her despite the careful guidance of her ladies. Pearls, far too heavy for her fine-boned head, crowned the braids of her dark hair. She could not have seen more than 7 summers. I steadied myself against the carved oak rail of the altar, murmuring a brief plea for the Lord's wisdom. In my lifetime I had married maidens of 13 to noblemen twice their age, yes, but never a bride this young. Yet I knew the times in which I lived. Alliances were built in cradles, wars ended in the exchange of rings rather than swords. The plague had torn through our lands within living memory. Peace, when it appeared, had to be seized before it vanished like morning mist. Edmund's vows were spoken in a voice as steady as the abbey walls, but with a gentleness that surprised me. He bent low so the child might see his face, and when she recited her small part, words carefully taught to her in a language she did not yet fully understand, he gave her an encouraging smile, like a father to a daughter learning her first letters. The treaty was clear: this marriage would remain unconsummated until she came of age. Ameline would be raised in England, her youth a living promise that Albion and France could grow into peace together. As I blessed their union, I could not shake a question that crept unbidden into my heart. In a court as treacherous as ours, could any child truly be safe? Section 2. The Child from Across the Sea. Long before her small feet touched English soil, Princess Ameline's life had been charted by forces she could not comprehend. She had been born on a frosty dawn in the winter of 1388, in the sprawling stone halls of the Palais de Saint Laurent, Paris. The midwives, bundled in wool against the draughty chambers, whispered of omens, a hawk circling above the palace courtyard, a snowfall so fine it looked like sifted flour. Her father, King Louis XI of France, was a man feared and pitied in equal measure. Prone to sudden, bewildering episodes in which he claimed to be made of crystal and forbade anyone from touching him, Louis's mind would vanish behind a veil of terrors for weeks at a time. On good days, he was a sharp diplomat and a loving father, bouncing Ameline on his knee while she giggled at his stories of knights and saints. On bad days, he would pace the gallery, convinced assassins waited behind every tapestry, or refused to move for fear his glass bones might shatter. Her mother, Queen Isabeau of Anjou, possessed the steel to hold the realm together in her husband's absence. She was beautiful in the way marble statues are, flawless and cold when she wished to be. She understood well that her children were bargaining pieces on Europe's great chessboard. She had already placed her eldest son in a betrothal to secure Burgundy's loyalty. Ameline, her second child and first daughter, was destined for something grander, the binding of England and France in a marriage that might finally still the blood tide of the 100 Years' War. France and England had bled each other for decades. Villages on both sides lay blackened from raids. Fields once thick with grain had become battlefields. By the 1390s, both kingdoms sagged under the weight of war's cost. Edmund IV's advisors sought a truce, and Louis's ministers saw a chance to seal it in flesh and blood. The idea emerged: marry the French king's young daughter to the English monarch. Raise her in England so she would grow into a queen shaped by its customs, loyal to her husband's realm. At first, King Edmund resisted. His beloved first wife, Queen Eleanor of Bohemia, had died of a sudden illness the year before, and the grief was still raw. To marry again so soon, and to a child, felt like a betrayal. But the arguments were relentless. A dowry of 800,000 francs. A truce of 30 years. A chance to focus England's resources away from France and toward its restless northern borders. And perhaps, though he never admitted it aloud, the thought of guiding and protecting an innocent from the storms of court appealed to something deep in him. Months of negotiations followed. Letters crossed the Channel, each sealed with wax and heavy with stipulations. Ameline would keep her French ladies in waiting. She would correspond with her parents freely. And above all, the marriage would not be touched in the bedchamber until she came of age. While nobles haggled over parchment, Ameline played in her nursery, blissfully unaware her life was being packed into chests. Her governess began slipping English words into their lessons. Sun, bread, flour, and her seamstresses stitched gowns that would fit her now and others she might grow into. The girl listened wide-eyed to tales of Albion, imagining a land of endless green hills and castles with towers so high they brushed the clouds. When the treaty was signed, it was as though the wind shifted in both kingdoms. Soldiers on the front lines murmured of peace, merchants dreamt of reopened trade routes. And somewhere in the heart of Paris, a small girl was told she would soon be queen of a place she had never seen, married to a man whose face she would first glimpse on her wedding day. Section 3. The Two Weddings. The crossing to England was not immediate. Protocol dictated that the first ceremony take place on neutral soil, and so in the autumn of 1395, Ameline left Paris in a procession that might have passed for a fairy tale to anyone not privy to the stakes behind it. Her litter was lined with furs against the bite of the Channel winds. Courtiers in velvet cloaks rode alongside, and soldiers bearing both the lilies of France and the lions of England formed her escort. The roads were lined with peasants craning their necks to see the little princess. Some tossed petals, others, in hushed voices, made the sign of the cross as though to guard her from ill fate. The port town of Calais, held by England since Edward III's wars, was chosen for the first vows. The great hall of its castle was hung with banners of both kingdoms, the floor strewn with fragrant herbs to sweeten the air. I was there. Standing just behind the Archbishop, my prayer book clasped so tight my knuckles blanched, as King Edmund entered the hall. He moved with a soldier's precision, but his eyes softened the moment they fell upon the child before him. Ameline, dressed in cloth of gold so heavy it required 2 maids to carry the hem, seemed rooted to the spot. The hall was vast, the air thick with the gaze of strangers. When Edmund approached, he bent until they were eye to eye. "It is only a promise, little one," he said softly in French. "A promise to be friends." Witnesses later remarked that her small shoulders eased at his tone. She took his hand, her tiny fingers swallowed by his gloved palm, and together they walked to the altar. Rings were exchanged, vows spoken, and though Ameline stumbled over the unfamiliar cadence of her part, Edmund's encouraging smile never wavered. This first marriage was a formality, a symbol for diplomats and scribes. The true spectacle came a year later in London. The city had been preparing for weeks. Streets were scrubbed, garlands of evergreen hung from the timbered houses, and every window along the royal route was bright with candlelight. Ameline's coronation procession began at dawn. She sat in a litter draped with silk embroidered in English roses entwined with French lilies, the winter sun catching on the pearls in her hair. Crowds surged, eager for a glimpse of the child queen. More than once, guards had to push the throng back to keep the litter moving. The abbey bells rang out as she entered Westminster, where the nave blazed with hundreds of candles. Her crown had been specially made, lighter than a full sovereign's, but no less intricate, studded with sapphires to match the hue of her eyes. As she knelt before the altar, I caught the faintest trace of awe in her gaze. The solemn Latin of the coronation rites likely meant little to her, yet she responded to each cue with precision drilled into her by her governesses. By the time she rose, she was no longer merely a princess from across the sea. In the eyes of England, she was their queen. That night, the celebration spilled from the palace into the streets. Musicians played until their fingers cramped. Tables groaned under roasted game and honey tarts. And amid the toasts and laughter, I watched King Edmund keep a quiet vigil over the small figure at his side, a guardian as much as a husband. Section 4. Life at the English Court. After the coronation feasts faded into memory, life in Westminster settled into a rhythm that, to the child queen, seemed at once strange and thrilling. Amelini's apartments occupied a warm corner of the palace overlooking the gardens, their walls hung with woven tapestries depicting English victories and saints unknown to her. The floors were strewn with fresh rushes scented with lavender, and in winter, braziers were kept alight day and night. Her household was a careful balance of French and English attendants, a political compromise hammered out in the treaty. Madame Eloise, her French governess, presided over the schoolroom with brisk authority, ensuring that Ameline continued her studies in her native tongue. But there was also Lady Agnes de Clare, a widow of the king's cousin, who took it upon herself to teach the child English manners. How to curtsy low without wobbling, how to address a duke versus an earl, and the subtle art of making polite conversation with lords twice one's age. The king himself visited often. Sometimes he came with gifts, a painted lute from Lombardy, a pair of doves in a gilded cage, a tiny book of psalms bound in green leather. Other times he simply sat in her solar, telling stories of the northern hills or listening patiently as she stumbled through her English lessons. More than once, I overheard him gently correcting her pronunciation, his tone warm, never mocking. It was not long before she had companions her own age. Children of the nobility were often raised at court, their families eager to place them in the king's favor. Amelini's closest friend became Lady Margaret de Vere, a lively girl of 10 whose quick wit made the younger queen laugh until her sides ached. The two would escape into the palace gardens, cloaks billowing, to play at knights and ladies or feed crumbs to the swans on the Thames. But even in her games, Ameline absorbed the currents of politics that swirled around her. Margaret, wise beyond her years, whispered the names of the factions at court, the earls who grumbled at the king's generosity toward his favorites, the lords who still clung to memories of war with France. "They smile when you pass," Margaret once warned. "But some would rather see you sent home in disgrace than see peace last." By her 8th birthday, Ameline's English was fluent, her accent softened by months of immersion. She learned to drink spiced wine instead of watered ale, to prefer the long flowing English gowns over the tighter French bodices. She could recite the names of every peer of the realm and knew which families were allied, which were rivals, and which might change sides with the wind. It was in these years that I began to see her as more than a child fulfilling a treaty. She was becoming a creature of two worlds, French by blood, English by upbringing, and she carried herself with the careful dignity of one who understood her very existence was a bridge between kingdoms. Section 5. The Shadows of Rebellion. By the spring of 1398, the air in Westminster had changed. It was not a thing one could see or name outright, no banners raised in defiance, no mobs at the gates, but it clung to the court like a damp fog. Conversation would halt when certain lords entered the great hall. Smiles became a shade too measured, courtesies a fraction too stiff. I began to notice fewer of the king's most trusted men at table. Some, like the Earl of Shrewsbury, had been sent to manage estates in distant shires. Others simply stopped coming, their absence explained with vague mentions of illness or private business. Ameline was too young to understand the depth of the change, but she was not blind. She saw the worry in Lady Agnes's eyes, heard the murmured French between Madame Eloise and the other ladies when they thought she was absorbed in her embroidery. King Edmund, who had once visited her solar every few days, now came less often. When he did, the lightness in his manner was muted, his thoughts elsewhere. Once, when she asked why he stared so long out the window toward the river, he said only, "There are storms that do not show themselves in the sky, little one." It was Margaret de Vere who whispered the truth to her in the garden one crisp morning. "It's your king's cousin, Lord Henry of Lancaster. He was banished last year, but they say he's gathering men across the sea. Men with armor and grievances." "What grievance?" Ameline asked. Margaret shrugged. "That the king keeps too much power for himself. That he listens to his friends and not the lords. That he's too fond of peace with France." Margaret's eyes darted around, lowering her voice to a hiss. "They say if Henry returns, the throne itself might change hands." The thought settled into Ameline's chest like a cold stone. In her brief years in England, she had come to think of Edmund's crown as unshakable, a thing fixed in place like the abbey walls. Now she began to see the crown for what it was, a prize others might reach for if the moment was right. By midsummer, the rumors were no longer whispers. Messengers came and went at all hours. The king rode out to meet with his allies, sometimes for weeks at a stretch. One humid night, Ameline was woken by the clatter of armored boots in the corridor. Lady Agnes appeared moments later, her voice low but urgent. "Your Grace, you must dress. His Majesty wishes you moved to a safer lodging." The safe lodging proved to be the Tower of London, a fortress as old as the Conquest, looming over the Thames with its pale stone walls. To Ameline, it was as much prison as palace. The windows were barred, the gates guarded day and night. Her French attendants were allowed to remain, but most of her English ladies were dismissed. For their own safety. It was the first time she had truly felt alone in England. Edmund visited her there once more before riding north. He knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. "You are not to be afraid," he told her. "Whatever happens, you are under my protection." But even at 9 years old, Ameline could see the truth in his eyes. There were things now beyond his power to protect. Section 6. The Usurper's Arrival. The day Lord Henry came for the crown began like any other grey morning on the Thames, the water sluggish under a mist that clung stubbornly to the banks. From the barred window of her tower chamber, Ameline watched the shapes of boats drift past, until she noticed the banners. Red and gold, the colors of Lancaster, fluttering on masts where royal pennants should have flown. By noon, the echo of boots in the corridor told her something had shifted. The guards outside her door were strangers now, their armor burnished but bearing the new crest. When the bolts were drawn back, it was not the familiar captain of the watch who entered, but a tall man with a commander's bearing and a face carved in hard lines. Behind him, flanked by men-at-arms, walked Lord Henry himself, or rather King Henry now, if one were to accept his claim. His hair, darker than Edmund's, was threaded with early grey, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. Ameline rose and curtsied low, as she had been taught to do for any sovereign. "Your Grace," Henry said, inclining his head in return. He was courteous, but his voice carried the weight of a man accustomed to obedience. "I regret we meet under such altered circumstances." "What has become of the king?" she asked, her voice careful but steady. "King Edmund," Henry replied, deliberately using her husband's name rather than his title, "has yielded his crown to me." She was old enough now to understand the word yielded could mean many things, most of them ending with a blade or a cell. But she did not press. "And what becomes of me, sire?" "That," Henry said, "depends on many factors, the counsel of my advisers, your father's will, and your own conduct in the days ahead." His gaze lingered on her for a long moment, assessing not just her poise but perhaps the worth of keeping her in his realm at all. After he left, Madame Eloise came to her side, speaking in French. "Do not fear. You are still the Queen of England in the eyes of God and of France. He cannot undo the vows you swore." But in the weeks that followed, it became clear that in the eyes of Henry's court, she was no queen, merely a bargaining piece. Some argued she should be sent back to France at once, ending the expense of her upkeep. Others saw her as a pawn worth holding, a living thread between England and the fragile truce. Ameline played her part with the precision of a court-bred child. She was unfailingly polite to her captors, never offering offense, never speaking against the new king. But she carried herself with the dignity of one who still wore a crown, even if it was invisible now. Whispers began to reach her of Edmund's fate, first that he was alive in captivity, then that he had died, and finally, more grim still, that his death had been arranged to prevent any challenge to Henry's reign. She did not weep where the servants could see, but I saw her one night kneeling alone in the Tower Chapel, her small hands clenched white around her rosary, lips moving soundlessly. Section 7. The Return to France. The offer came in the bleak heart of winter. Snow crusted the tower's inner courtyard, the Thames a sluggish ribbon of grey beyond its walls. A messenger from Henry's council arrived with terms written in neat, deliberate hand. Princess Ameline would be permitted to return to her father's court in France, but only if she acknowledged Henry as the rightful king of England and renounced any claim she might hold as Edmund's widow. It was a trap of courtesy, gilded with false choice. Accepting would mean freedom, the chance to see her family again after nearly 4 years, but also the tacit admission that her marriage had been nothing more than a political maneuver, easily undone. Refusing might preserve her title in theory, but in practice, it would mean remaining a prisoner, a lonely child kept behind stone walls until she outlived her usefulness. Her French household was divided. Madame Eloise urged her to accept. "Your Grace, you will be safer in Paris. There you can be a daughter again, not a pawn in another man's game." But Lady Agnes, who had been allowed occasional visits, counseled the opposite. "If you yield, you give him everything. In England's eyes, you become nothing." For weeks, Ameline wrestled with the decision. I saw her pacing the narrow length of her chamber, her fingers twisting in her skirts, her gaze fixed on the frost-laced window. Once she turned to me suddenly and asked, "If I return, will England forget me?" I had no answer that would not wound her. In the end, the choice was taken from her. A letter arrived from King Louis himself, one of his lucid days, commanding her return at once. His words were heavy with paternal affection but also with political calculation. France would not tolerate prolonged negotiations over his daughter's fate. To delay would be considered an act of hostility. Henry's council, unwilling to spark war over a child, agreed swiftly. The conditions of her departure were left deliberately vague so each side could claim the version of events that best suited them. When the day came, the court at the Tower was strangely subdued. Her trunks had been packed days before, each gown and jewel inventoried by English clerks. She wore a deep blue cloak lined with fur, the hood drawn up against the cold. The river mist clung to her hair as she was led to the waiting barge. I walked beside her to the dock. She looked back once, not at the tower's high walls, but toward the city beyond, the place where she had learned a new tongue, where she had been crowned, where she had grown from a frightened child into a poised young girl. "Will it be as I remember?" she murmured. "Nothing ever is," I said softly. The oars dipped into the water, pulling her toward the ship that would carry her across the channel. England's shore faded behind her, and with it, the chapter of her life in which she had been the Queen of Albion. Section 8. A stranger in her own land. The ship made landfall at Boulogne-sur-Mer under a pale spring sun. French banners snapped in the sea wind, and the harbor rang with the clang of bells to mark the return of the king's daughter. Yet as Ameline stepped ashore, the familiarity she had expected did not come. The cadence of French felt strange on her tongue after years of English speech, and the faces that greeted her were not the ones she remembered. A train of mounted knights escorted her south to Paris, the journey taking over a week along roads greening with early leaves. Villagers came to watch her pass, calling blessings in a language she had once spoken without thought. Now her replies felt slow, as though she were translating herself. At the Palais de Saint Laurent, her mother, Queen Isabeau, received her with an embrace that was warm yet calculating. "Ma fille," she said, holding Ameline at arm's length to study her face. "England has made you taller." Her gaze flicked over the girl's English cut gown and fur-lined cloak. "And changed your taste in dress, I see." Her father, King Louis, was absent from the welcome. Ameline learned why the following morning, when she was summoned to his chambers. He lay in bed, the curtains drawn, muttering to himself. For several minutes he did not seem to know her at all. Only when the Queen spoke his name sharply did he look at his daughter, eyes clearing for a fleeting moment. "Ah, my little Ameline," he murmured before drifting back into his mutterings. Life in Paris proved no easier than in London. The French court had altered in her absence. New alliances had formed, old rivals had shifted in rank, and Ameline, either fully a child nor yet a woman, found herself navigating a web of courtesy as tangled as any she had known across the sea. Some courtiers greeted her warmly, eager to hear stories of the English court. Others looked at her with thinly veiled suspicion, seeing in her the shadow of a foreign queen whose marriage had failed. Her mother quickly put her to use. At supper, Isabeau would seat her beside visiting envoys, coaxing from her details about English customs, military strengths, and which lords had seemed most loyal to Henry. Ameline, remembering her friendships and the gentle face of King Edmund, gave answers that were polite but unrevealing. She would not see England bled again in her name. Even so, she could feel herself being drawn into the machinery of French politics. At just 11 years old, she was already whispered about as a valuable match for one of the kingdom's powerful allies. Each formal dinner seemed less about food and more about weighing her against the ambitions of the men across the table. Paris was the city of her birth, but in those first months she often felt like a guest wearing a mask. The language, the customs, even the sense of the palace all strangely foreign. At night, in her bedchamber lined with silk, she found herself missing the smell of English gardens after rain, and the sound of bells ringing from Westminster across the river. Section 9. Suitors and Schemes. By the spring of 1402, whispers of marriage began to swirl around Ameline like the first warm breezes after a long winter, gentle at first, then constant, and impossible to ignore. At 11, she was still too young for a wedding, but in the courts of Europe, betrothals could be arranged years in advance. The first offer came from the Duke of Savoy, whose lands straddled the Alps and served as a key gateway for trade between France and Italy. His envoys arrived in Paris with chests of silver plate and bolts of Florentine silk, their compliments dripping like honey. A union between Savoy and the daughter of France, they told Queen Isabeau, would bind our houses in friendship and ensure safe passage for your merchants. Another came from Aragon, carried on the tongues of diplomats who praised Ameline's cosmopolitan upbringing, a polite way of saying she had survived both the French and English courts. The King of Aragon's younger son, barely 15, was said to be clever and ambitious, eager for a bride who might match his wit. But it was the offer from within France itself that stirred the most interest, and the most caution. Charles, Duke of Anjou, cousin to Ameline on her mother's side, sent word of his willingness to marry her when she reached a suitable age. His family's holdings were rich, his court refined, and his influence in the south unmatched. For Isabeau, the match promised to keep her daughter close while strengthening ties to one of the kingdom's most powerful noble lines. Ameline listened to each proposal with the quiet composure she had learned in England. Yet when alone with Madame Eloise, she would confess her private doubts. "They speak of alliances, not of me. No one asks what I want." "Because, child," Eloise replied gently, "what you want will matter only if it serves the crown. You must learn to shape your desires so they do." Even so, Ameline could not help imagining what such lives might be like. She pictured the mountains of Savoy, the sun-warmed coasts of Aragon, the perfumed gardens of Anjou. But she also remembered King Edmund's promise in Calais, his steady voice telling her it was only a pledge to be friends. That had been a marriage arranged for peace, yet it had carried moments of kindness. Would another match offer her the same? Or would it be only a transaction, cold and final? In the meantime, her mother began involving her in subtle diplomatic work. Ameline was asked to attend audiences with foreign envoys, to stand at her mother's side during formal receptions, to offer greetings in languages she had been taught since childhood. Each time she spoke, she felt the eyes of the court measuring her, not just her words, but her bearing, her manners, her very presence. She was a prize to be displayed, a promise in human form. It was during one such audience, with an emissary from Burgundy, that Ameline noticed the first ripple of tension in her mother's carefully composed expression. The Burgundian envoys had brought no marriage proposal, only questions, pointed ones, about Ameline's years in England, her knowledge of its defenses, and her thoughts on King Henry's hold on the throne. Ameline answered with soft politeness, offering nothing of substance. But that night she overheard her mother speaking in low tones to an adviser. She must be guarded as carefully as any fortress. In her mind lies more than 1 crown's worth of secrets. Section 10. A Court of Factions. The French court was not a single body moving with one will, but a nest of serpents coiled together, each with its own hunger, each waiting for the chance to strike. By 1403, Ameline had learned to recognize the subtle signs, the careful way one duke would step aside to avoid crossing the path of another, the deliberate absence of certain lords from royal audiences, the sudden silences at feasts when politics crept too close to the surface. 2 factions dominated the court. On one side was the House of Burgundy, wealthy from trade and wielding influence over the northern cities. On the other was the Orleanist faction, led by Ameline's uncle, Louis of Orleans, brother to her father and a man of restless ambition. Her mother, Queen Isabel, favored the Orleanists, though she wore her allegiance like a silken veil, seen only when she wished. A queen must keep her friends close, she once told Ameline as they sat together in her private solar. But her enemies closer still. Even those you smile at across the table may wish for your fall. Ameline listened and remembered. She had heard such warnings before in England, whispered by Lady Agnes when lords quarrelled in the King's Hall. But here in France, the stakes felt sharper. This was her blood, her birthright, and the blades, whether steel or words, were aimed at her kin. It was at a winter feast that she saw the rivalry laid bare. The Burgundian Duke arrived late, the air of the great hall cooling as he strode to his seat without bowing to Louis of Orleans. Conversation faltered, goblets stilled midway to lips. Her mother's eyes flicked toward Ameline, a silent instruction to keep her composure. Later, in the corridors, she overheard a heated exchange between one of her mother's ladies and a Burgundian envoy. "Your master grows bold," the lady said sharply. "Bold men meet sharp ends," came the reply. That night, Ameline lay awake, turning the words over in her mind. She had seen boldness topple crowns before. King Edmund had been bold in his peace with France, and it had cost him everything. Her own position in this tangle was delicate. Too closely aligned with the Orleanists, and she would earn the enmity of Burgundy. Too warm toward Burgundy, and she might be seen as disloyal to her family. Even her youth could not shield her entirely. There were always whispers that she might one day be wed into one faction or the other, tipping the balance like a counter placed on a gaming board. It was during these uneasy months that she began keeping her own counsel. She spoke less in gatherings, choosing her words with care, answering questions with phrases that could mean one thing or another depending on the listener. She practiced the art of silence, not emptiness, but a silence that invited others to reveal themselves. By the year's end, her skill in this was being quietly remarked upon. "The little Queen of Albion has learned the French game," one courtier was heard to say. And in truth she had, though she could not yet guess how soon she would have to play it in earnest. Section 11. The Marriage to Orleans. The proposal came quietly, without the fanfare that had accompanied earlier suitors, yet it carried the weight of inevitability. In the spring of 1404, Louis, Duke of Orleans, sent word that his eldest son, Charles, would take Ameline as his bride. The match, he argued, would keep her firmly within the royal bloodline, shield her from foreign intrigues, and strengthen the Orleanist hold on court. Queen Isabeau received the message in her private chambers. I was present, summoned to record correspondence, and watched as she broke the seal with a slow, deliberate motion. He has chosen his moment well, she murmured, scanning the parchment. Burgundy grows restless, and my daughter's hand could sway the wind. When Ameline was told, she did not feign surprise. She had seen it coming for months, in the lingering glances between her mother and the Orleanist envoys, in the way Charles himself had begun to appear more frequently at court. He was 28 now, handsome in a sharp, angular way, his speech quick with wit and learned references. Unlike some noblemen, he did not speak down to her, but asked questions as if her thoughts truly mattered. Their first private conversation took place in the Queen's rose garden. Charles paced as he spoke, gesturing with long-fingered hands. You know the game we play here, he said. Burgundy believes France belongs to his coffers. I believe otherwise. If we stand together, our families together, we will have the strength to hold this realm when others seek to break it. And what of me? Ameline asked. Am I to be only a bridge between houses? He stopped pacing, looking at her fully. You are far more than that. You have lived in 2 kingdoms. You understand the mind of England as well as France. I would not marry a bridge. I would marry an ally. Those words, more than any promise of jewels or estates, softened her. She had spent her life as a symbol. Here, perhaps, was a chance to be a partner. The negotiations moved swiftly. The Burgundians grumbled but did not openly oppose, calculating that an open quarrel would only push Ameline more firmly into Orleanist hands. The wedding was set for midsummer of 1406, to take place at the Cathedral of Saint Denis. On the day, Paris seemed determined to show its splendor. The streets between the palace and the cathedral were strewn with flowers. Balconies overflowed with spectators craning for a glimpse of the bride. Ameline wore deep blue silk embroidered with golden fleurs-de-lis, her hair crowned with sapphires that caught the sunlight like drops of water. Charles waited at the altar, his expression unguarded for once, not the calculating gaze of a politician, but the open smile of a man pleased with the choice before him. When they exchanged vows, they spoke directly to each other, not to the crowd, and I saw in her eyes a spark I had not seen since the early days in England. This marriage, unlike the first, was not the binding of a child to a stranger. It was the joining of 2 minds that understood the perilous game they were entering, and were willing to play it side by side. Section 12. The Duchess's New Court. Life in Orleans was unlike Paris or London. The ducal palace sat above the river Loire, its towers catching the morning sun, its halls quieter but no less opulent than a royal court. Here, away from the constant press of Parisian politics, Ameline found room to breathe, and to build. Charles encouraged her to shape their household as she wished. She gathered poets, musicians, and scholars, creating a circle that became the envy of France for its refinement. At her request, a scriptorium was established to copy rare manuscripts, some in Latin, some in the French she hoped her children would one day master. She corresponded with abbots, merchants, and even discreet contacts in England, cultivating channels of knowledge that went beyond the usual court gossip. Their first child, a daughter named Isabel, was born in the spring of 1407. Ameline insisted on being a present mother, often keeping the baby beside her in the council chamber or solar. 2 years later came a son, Louis, his birth greeted with the ringing of church bells across Orleans. The joy was tempered, however, by the rising tide of unrest in France. The feud between Burgundy and Orleans grew bloodier, spilling into open street violence. When Charles's father was murdered in Paris by Burgundian agents in 1407, the air in the palace changed overnight. Guards doubled at the gates, letters were burned after reading, and Ameline found herself discussing strategy with her husband late into the night. She had known factional rivalry before, but now it was war. She played her role with quiet precision, corresponding with allies, offering sanctuary to loyal families, and ensuring the safety of their children above all else. Yet the strain began to tell. By 1409, after the difficult birth of their third child, Jean, her health faltered. Illness came more often, lingering longer. Still, she refused to fade into the background. In 1410, when Burgundy sought an alliance with England, it was Ameline who urged Charles to open discreet talks to counter it. Drawing on her years in London, she penned careful letters to English nobles, warning them that entangling themselves in France's civil war would serve either crown. But time was against her. By the spring of 1412, her body, weakened by childbirth and infection, could no longer keep pace with her mind. She spent her final months in the palace gardens when the weather allowed, her children gathered close, instructing them in languages, history, and the art of listening before speaking. On an autumn morning that year, she died quietly, surrounded by family. She was just 24. Her passing was mourned not only in Orleans but in Paris and even in whispers across the Channel. She had been queen, prisoner, princess, duchess, and through all of it, a survivor who had learned to wield the tools her world gave her: words, alliances, and a steadfast heart. In the years that followed, her children would carry her lessons into their own tangled fates, and her story would be told as both a caution and an inspiration, of a girl who had crossed seas, bridged kingdoms, and left her mark on both.